Is Qatar corrupting US politics? President Trump's second term has been very different from the first, especially when it comes to foreign policy and the Middle East. Is Qatar the reason why? We're going to explore that on today's Trumpet World. During President Trump's first term in office, he was a strong supporter of Israel and a major opponent of Iran. He shut down the Iranian nuclear deal, he killed Qasem Soleimani, the terrorist leader, and generally contained Iran within the Middle East. And now, though, he's offering Iran a new deal, and he's pressured Israel to sign a ceasefire with Hamas, who hate them and used previous peace deals to launch the October 7th attack. Now, some have traced this radical change in Trump administrations to the relationship between Mr. Trump's team and Qatar. You've probably heard of the Flying Palace, as it's been called, that Qatar has offered to serve as Air Force One. But there's a much broader story to this as well. Mihailo Zekic is covering that story for our latest Trumpet Print edition. He joins us today. Mihailo, can you start by giving us some background on Qatar? Just who is this little state that is taking over the news?
Well, it's a small Gulf state in the Persian Gulf, an Arab country that's on a peninsula, on the Arabian Peninsula. So if you imagine the Arabian Peninsula, you could see a little bit jutting out into the Persian Gulf. That's Qatar. It's ruled by an absolute monarchy. The leader's full title and name is Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, or we could just call him Sheikh Tamim for the rest of the program. It's a former British colony, but his family has been ruling it as a protectorate for a long time. Not too many people. If memory serves me right, there's about under 1 million people there that are actually Qatari citizens, and the rest of the approximately 5 million or so are like foreign temporary workers from places like India and Pakistan to help build all the beautiful buildings that you see in Doha, like a lot of other countries in the region. And about 2 or 3 decades ago, there was a bit of a boom when people realized just how many fossil fuels there were in the area and how much people were willing to pay for them. In Qatar's case, it's natural gas. It's the third largest exporter of natural gas in the world. That sent a lot of revenue to this country that, again, doesn't have too many mouths to feed, which meant there was a lot of extra money going around for, say, a lot of fancy building projects. If you go to Doha today, a lot of it, the capital, a lot of it is designed specifically to imitate Venice and some of these great European cityscapes. More famously, of course, in 2022, they hosted the FIFA World Cup, which a lot of people are wondering, how did this tiny country that's never qualified for the World Cup in the first place and didn't have enough stadiums to even house the tournament itself, got the tournament? We'll get into that a little bit later. But that was obviously a very big international celebration that caught the world's attention. But Qatar does not just spend its money on some of these vanity projects or media-grabbing, attention-grabbing programs.
Well, before we get into that, just to kind of complete this background, are they Sunni or Shia?
They are Sunni. Most countries in the Arabian Peninsula follow Sunni Islam. Shia Islam is obviously the type of Islam that Iran follows, and some other countries like Iraq, Lebanon that have significant Shia populations, but Qatar is Sunni.
And in this kind of divide between Saudi Arabia and Iran, where Iran, obviously the big Shia champion within the Middle East, but still works with some Sunni groups like Hamas, versus Saudi Arabia, where does Qatar fall there?
Sort of in the middle. They are technically a different branch of Islam than Iran, but if you look at, say, the Saudis or the United Arab Emirates, some of these more quote-unquote moderate countries, they are, say, projecting their power through economic means and through cultural means and other things like that. Qatar is definitely a more religious society. It is an emirate. It is not technically a theocracy. It's not like the clergy is ruling the country like it is in Iran or in Afghanistan or other places. It's ruled by an absolute monarchy, a secular ruler, but a secular ruler that has implemented Sharia law. You can't buy alcohol in most places in Qatar, for example, or if memory serves me, I don't think anywhere. Blasphemy is illegal.
How did that work for the World Cup?
A lot of people were angry that they couldn't get beer. I believe they were going to make an exception, and then they canceled the exception, and then a lot of fans were angry, but there wasn't really much they could do about it at that point.
Not massively relevant, but I was just curious, given beer drinking such a big part of the World Cup. Sorry, you were talking about how they fit in with Iran.
Yes, so they will work with Iran. They have a bit of a reputation as being somebody that will work with anybody in the Middle East, and we'll get to a little bit later on what that's a cloak for. But they fit, they're not really in anybody's camp is the best way to put it. They're in their own camp, which for such a tiny country is a pretty remarkable achievement, but they're able to push their weight around quite well.
Right, because I think a lot of these smaller nations, whenever I hear UAE, Bahrain, they seem very much tied to Saudi Arabia, and they just kind of do whatever Saudi Arabia does. That's probably an oversimplification, but that makes it easy to understand. Qatar, even though it's small, even though it's in the same general area, it doesn't just simply follow the Saudi lead, and that leads to some important distinctions, which I think you're planning to get to in just a little bit, about some of their ties to these different groups across the Middle East. But I did interrupt you when you were giving a rundown of some of their. Now we've got some more of that general background. I think you were about to give a little more of just some of their recent history and dealings.
Yes. So, as I mentioned, they're Sunni. They're not Shia. Iran, when it sponsors, say, terror groups around the Middle East, like Hezbollah, like the Houthis, usually those are Shia groups. Qatar is basically the Sunni equivalent of that. Most Sunni terror groups, one way or another, can trace their connections, funding, diplomatic protection even, to Qatar. Which groups am I talking about? You mentioned Hamas. Iran sponsors Hamas. So does Qatar. There's been varying estimates on how much money Qatar has been sending Hamas, specifically through the Gaza Strip before October 7th. One that is fairly well established is about $30 million a month. As I mentioned, Qatar has a lot of money to burn with all this fossil fuel exports, and so they can afford sending them $30 million a month. But it's not just Hamas. It's also the Taliban, the group that's in Afghanistan right now. When the U.S. went into Afghanistan, they found political refuge in Qatar. Even Al-Qaeda, Qatar was funding Osama bin Laden even back in the 1990s before the 9/11 terrorist attacks obviously happened. And there's even evidence to suggest they were protecting certain wanted terrorists with Al-Qaeda from U.S. custody. And to this day, the Muslim Brotherhood, the group that used to have power in Egypt, the grandfather, you could say, of all Islamist movements, its spiritual leader is based in Doha right now. So in the same way that you're seeing Iran have influence with all these different Shia groups, most of these really important Sunni terror groups, not all of them, but most of them, have links one way or another to Qatar.
So why does America talk to Qatar a lot? And this is not just Donald Trump, is it? I believe there's a military base there. I mean, they treat Qatar very differently to the way they've treated Afghanistan, say, or other state sponsors of terrorism. Why hasn't Qatar been treated as a state sponsor of terrorism and been kind of part of the axis of evil and, shall we say, dealt with?
Well, Qatar played their cards very, very well. Going back decades, they probably saw where the general trend was going with America getting more involved in the Middle East, and they preempted a lot of these tensions by their huge pocketbooks and spending money to get influence with the United States. You mentioned the military base, their Al Udeid Air Base. That is right now the logistical hub for the United States in the Middle East. That's where a lot of airstrikes happen out, whether happening in Iraq or other places. It's considered the Pentagon's primary intelligence gathering hub, etc., the main base of operations in the area, and Qatar pays for it completely. A lot of other military bases, the U.S. pays to host bases there. In this air base's case, Qatar pays for everything. But because of that, they also get to have a lot of leverage with the United States on where they do strikes, for example. They pressure the United States, for example, with this airbase not to use it against Iran, which, as I mentioned, they have connections to. But it's not just the airbase. There are other avenues, I guess you could say, that the Qatari leadership has used its massive levels of funding to get influence in with the United States. One big one is with the with its massive investment of American colleges and universities. The U.S. government started tracking foreign sponsorship, foreign funding of the U.S. Or of higher education in the U.S. since 1986. Guess where Qatar is on that list from 1986 to now? Number one. It has spent since 1986 $6.3 billion in funding for colleges and universities. By comparison, the runner-up, China, spent $5.6 billion. So that's almost $1 billion more than China. And the next one is the UAE. So you could see that Qatar's even outspending its other Arab rivals in this regard. And we're talking about really big names like Harvard, Yale, Cornell, Stanford. A lot of these schools, these high-ranked, prestigious schools in the United States, get a lot of their funding from Qatar. The Walsh School of Foreign Services, the unofficial school where America's diplomatic corps gets their training. One of only 2 international campuses they have is in Doha. The other one's in Indonesia. So of all the world where America's diplomats go to get educated, one of them is in Doha. And even, I remember seeing something that's that campus in Doha, it ranks, I think, in the top 10 worst American campuses with free speech restrictions because of Qatar's Sharia law government. But they still have a campus there. I wonder why. And it's not just, it's not just, this isn't just, say, to build buildings, or to help these colleges functioning. Once that money comes in, that's where America's future leaders are coming out of, not just their diplomats, but also the leaders in business, the leaders in science, etc. And when you're having this kind of money being poured into these universities, when the employees of the universities are basically being funded by Qatar, you can imagine these people are going to have a very rosy picture of their sponsor giving them their education.
So the big question this raises, I guess, is why? They fund Al-Qaeda and Hamas and these organizations that are very much American enemies. They've also probably easily paid billions for this airbase and the US military presence in the Middle East. What do they get from funding both terrorists that hate America and America?
Well, as I mentioned, they are an Islamist theocracy. Maybe they're not necessarily as strict as, say, the Taliban or Iran or some of these other places. Western tourists can still visit Qatar, but they still do have an Islamist worldview, and they shove their weight around quite a bit heavily with implementing this worldview in other countries. Syria, for example, we've talked before about how their government is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Qatar is one of their biggest sponsors as well, and now they basically put a new government implementing this Sunni Islamist vision in Syria. But with sending so much money to the United States, you answered actually earlier before, they get treated very differently than, say, the Taliban or the Houthis or some of these other groups. Because they were able to get into the Washington establishment so much, whether it's through the Pentagon or through these schools or other means, everyone's afraid to touch Qatar now. If they touch Qatar, if they go after Qatar, that means all that funding is going to evaporate just like that. And not only that, I mean, at this point, with all these leaders, generations of leaders going through this system, it's probably going to be pretty hard for them to unsee Qatar as this benign sponsor that's willing to talk to everybody. And they just have a image that Qatar has deliberately cultivated of them not necessarily being a sponsor of terrorism, but just somebody, that's willing to talk to all sides and be a good middle ground character for international forums, for the good guys and the bad guys to speak to each other, etc. And their relatively more moderate position, again, with shiny new buildings and the veneer of modernity that the country on the ground looks like, helps feed into that narrative.
I guess, so those are the two rival views, really, of Qatar. Is some people look at Qatar more as this kind of place that they'll come and let everyone do business so that they can get rich, and that Qatar's main objective is to get rich, and therefore they cultivate ties with lots of people so that they can serve that role, and that role is then useful to the United States, both as a military base and as a mediator. That would probably be, say, the Steve Witkoff and the current Trump administration view of Qatar. what you're saying is that no, Qatar is much more of a radical Islamist power. Their motivation isn't necessarily about making money. Their motivation is more about spreading terror through the Middle East, spreading Islam, using terror, and they use money as a tool to get that end.
Exactly. And the very fact that you're having all these Islamist groups headquartered in Qatar in the first place is a big red flag about that. There's a reason they're not going to Saudi Arabia. There's a reason they're not going to Dubai. In a lot like the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, that's a listed terror organization in those countries because they rightfully fear that if we let these people in, they're going to have a revolution against us, like what happened in Egypt. Qatar's perfectly fine with that. They're not afraid of having a revolution. Why are they not afraid of having a revolution? Because they're fundamentally on the same side. Because these groups get money from Qatar, and they wouldn't be able to do what they're doing if it weren't for that. And another big example of that, in a bit more maybe I guess underhanded, is Qatar's sponsorship of Al Jazeera, the big Arab newspaper that is banned in a lot of Arab countries as well as Israel because it promotes terrorist narratives, because it, in many cases, if you look at, even if it's in its English language coverage, if you ever look at how it covers Hamas, if you ever look at how it covers all these other Palestinian terror groups, they can do no wrong and Israel can do no right. Or even the Palestinian Authority, if they ever get into a fight with Hamas, Hamas is always the good guy and the PA is always the bad guy. That's its English language coverage. If you look at its Arabic language coverage, it's even a lot more blatant in how they support these terrorist movements and how these people on the ground, you can imagine average citizen in an Arab country reading this and being influenced by this and being supportive of Hamas, or maybe even wanting to join Hamas. And that, which is a big reason why, again, a lot of these Arab countries ban Al Jazeera from even broadcasting in their countries.
So Qatar basically funding a US military base and getting a lot of favor for doing so. Clearly there's a quid pro quo there, but that's probably more just smart international diplomacy than, say, corruption. I guess some of what happens with the education system, the funding of universities, I think that definitely crosses a moral line, if not a legal line. But are there things that, say, cross that legal line into being at least investigated as corruption? You alluded earlier to more concrete examples of corruption. What has Qatar already done and kind of that is corrupt to spread its influence?
Well, depends on who you ask and depends on what the laws are in a given moment. But there are certainly, I guess you could say, things they've done that at the very least should be, as a matter of principle, something that Western governments shouldn't be allowed to get involved with, mainly conflicts of interest. Well, one big example is in 2022, one of the vice presidents of the European Union, Eva Kaili, she was arrested and indicted for basically accepting bribes from Qatar to influence European Parliament procedure. She hasn't been charged yet, or convicted yet. The case, I believe, is still ongoing. Right now in Israel, there's two aides of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu who are under investigation for accepting Qatari money to influence what's going on in the government right there. That's causing him a lot of problems. And even, I mentioned the World Cup earlier, the U.S. has indicted people for accepting bribes from Qatar to influence the World Cup coming to Qatar. That is the, if you look at it from a geopolitical standpoint, what Qatar mainly does is sponsor terrorism, but from the politics in the Western capitals themselves, like with everything else Qatar is doing, their main crime is by throwing money at people to get a voice in these governments, to get a voice in Washington, to get a voice in Brussels, to get a voice in Jerusalem, etc. And you could find stories, some a bit more well covered up than others, but of people all over the place being under allegations of having Qatar whisper into their ear what they want to do, whether it's for trade, whether it's for removing sanctions, etc. And Qatar, there's a lot of cases where people have gotten into trouble with this. There's a lot of cases where people haven't gotten into trouble with this. And this feeds into, like what you mentioned before, why there is so much of a double standard where Qatar does all these things in the Middle East, but everybody treats them very differently than other sponsors of terrorism.
Yeah, and going back to that EU scandal, because I tend to watch Europe, so that was very heavily on my radar a couple of years ago, where you had some really dramatic stories coming out of Brussels. Police raids on offices within the European Parliament. They pulled out bags of cash that Qatari agents, basically, or people in Qatar's pay, were passing around. They wanted visa-free travel to the European Union. As part of that, they wanted to quash any talk about Qatar's poor human rights record. And it's one of the biggest kind of out-and-out bribery scandals in European Union's history. So this is an organization that will, whether it's building America an airbase or handing out bags of cash and giving people tickets to soccer games, they will use that money to spread their influence. And they have a long history of using it incredibly strategically, like you pointed out with the universities even. That's some incredible long-term thinking there. It doesn't matter whether it's legitimate or illegitimate, and they will try and use this to advance their own interest and get other countries. I think the common thread for all of these is getting people in other countries to advocate for their interest, which then I think brings us to the Trump administration. Now, the big eye-catching thing has been Qatar coming out and saying, hey, would you like this luxury plane as Air Force One? And we talked about that in our Week in Review show on Friday. What you unearthed in this article you're working on the Trumpet print is there's a lot more than just that. What are the links between the Trump administration and Qatar?
Well, they're quite extensive. The biggest one that a lot of other people have covered is Mr. Witkoff, you mentioned, the special envoy to the Middle East, the man who's pressuring for a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, who's working with the Houthis, who's negotiating the Iranian nuclear program. He has some pretty heavy financial links to Qatar. Before he became a diplomat, like Mr. Trump, he was a New York real estate developer. He purchased a famous hotel in New York, the Park Lane Hotel, one of his co-owners. He was indicted for corruption or something along those lines and ended up fleeing to China. The hotel became a bit of a white elephant for Mr. Witkoff, who was left behind. He was losing money on it. But the Qatar Investment Authority, Qatar's sovereign wealth fund, stepped in and bought him out for $623 million. And that was, I believe it was either the year before or 2 years before he became now in his current role. So pretty not that long before he's doing what he's doing now, jet-setting to the Middle East, talking to all these people about solving conflicts in the Middle East, and Qatar basically handed him over $500 million. And for his part, you could see at the very least, Qatar has a very rosy image in his mind. Before President Trump even got into office, he gave a television interview where he said that Qatar was doing God's work. He's made plenty of trips there as a mediator, speaking to Hamas indirectly, etc. But he's not the only link.
Yeah, and I think just to his point, to the ones you're about to mention as well, I think this isn't brown paper bags of cash, kind of Qatargate, European Union style corruption. I think nobody's accusing Mr. Witkoff of breaking any laws here with this real estate deal. But he and many others have gotten a lot of money from Qatar. Qatar has spent lots of money with the intent of changing people's minds. From their point of view, I think it's very clear that that is what they were trying to do here. What Witkoff's intent, what Witkoff's motivations are, I'm not his judge. But I don't think there's any accusation that he's done anything illegal here. But I think it's just beyond dispute that Qatar is sloshing this money around, trying to change the minds of people within the Trump administration.
Exactly. And like you said, he didn't necessarily do anything illegal, but there is certainly a big red flag of a conflict of interest. And for some of them, these other people I'm going to mention, the conflict of interest, maybe they didn't get as much money, but there is a bigger case to be made for being a conflict of interest, like Pam Bondi, for example, the Attorney General. From 2019 to 2020, she actually worked as a lobbyist for Qatar. She was getting $115,000 a month for this. And when she had her Senate confirmation hearing, she refused to actually answer what she was getting paid for. A senator asked her, how does it feel to be paid by the same person that's paying Hamas? And she said, well, I'm proud of what I did, and I wish I could keep doing it. Since then, there's been some, the Free Press actually got a hold of her contract, and it said something about advocating against human trafficking, which is, of course, a good thing, but why is Qatar paying her so much for this, and why isn't she going into details what that advocating actually meant? There's still a lot of questions about that. And for Miss Bondi's part, she was also President Trump's personal lawyer before he was inaugurated, so she would be one of his closest confidants then, certainly on the legal side of things. Susie Wiles, his White House chief of staff, previously helped manage his campaign, President Trump's. She was in charge of the lobbying firm Mercury Public Affairs that was employed also by Qatar, or rather by the Embassy of Qatar in Washington, to advocate for Qatar. Who, again, nothing necessarily illegal about that, but both of them were literally working for this foreign government. Kash Patel, the FBI director, he has done some undisclosed work for Qatar for an undisclosed sum that, like Miss Bondi, he refused to detail what exactly that was in his Senate confirmation hearing. And some analysts even suspect, just with the few details we do know about, and the fact he won't say what it's all about, he may have violated the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And now he's in charge of the people that are prosecuting people for things like this, and so is Miss Bondi. And for her part, to go back to her for a little bit, on her first day in office, one of the things she did was lessen the restrictions on what it counts as being a foreign agent. So again, maybe not necessarily did anything illegal, but certainly there is at the very least some bad baggage that comes with some of these things going on. And it's not even necessarily the people that President Trump has appointed into his government, but also some of his more unofficial supporters, like, for example, Newsmax, a very popular pro-Trump news media organization in the United States. In 2019, there were a lot of bad stories coming out of Qatar, like you mentioned, about human rights abuses, about basically modern slavery conditions to help build all those shiny new stadiums to host the World Cup in. And one member of the Qatari royal family, they gave a $50 million funding to Newsmax, who then all of a sudden had an unofficial policy of not criticizing Qatar in any of their coverage. This is what one employee told the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, quote, "We were not allowed to criticize Qatar. We were told very clearly from the top down, no touching this," end quote. So Qatar gets a lot of bad coverage, a lot of bad press. This is leading up to the 2020 election. This is when President Trump was still in power. Who did they go to? Who did they start funding? President Trump's more favored news organizations. It was very clear, or I guess it appears to be very clear, that they're trying to send a message to a particular audience and trying to smooth out some of these scandals.
Yeah, I mean, that Newsmax really piece of information really does seem like a smoking gun here. That, okay, it's not just that they happened to pay this lawyer or whatever, that there was a deliberate concerted effort from Qatar to say, we need to get the MAGA movement on our side. Mm-hmm. And so we're not just paying individuals, we're going to give, for Newsmax, that's a relatively small organization, a huge amount of money. So I think, yeah, it's really compelling that Qatar have been trying to get MAGA on their side, and it seems like it's worked.
Mm-hmm. And even a lot of these people that I mentioned, the particular people that they're funding, who knows if they foresaw people getting into these roles, but, you know, the special envoy to the Middle East that's talking to Israel about like leaving Hamas alone, the people in charge of the Justice Department prosecuting people for having working for foreign governments. These are the kinds of people that, by investing in them, the Qatar is protecting their own hide and allowing their agenda in the Middle East to spread. Like you said, it is very, very selective. But going into, like you were saying, how it looks like these investments are paying off, the big one we've mentioned before, of course, is the ceasefire deal in January that Mr. Witkoff pressured Israel to take, that let Hamas live, that had Israel release over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, including terrorists with blood on their hands, people with rap sheets that no other Western government would even consider releasing out onto the streets. But there's also been a lot of progress since then, like we've been seeing lately with the U.S. pressuring Israel to accept another ceasefire, even as they're months away from liquidating Hamas completely. even as Qatar continues to host Hamas. Actually, there's an interesting story with that. At the very end of the Biden administration, they finally pressured Qatar to eject Hamas's leadership. Hamas is based in Doha. Their leaders, Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas until he was assassinated last year, he was living in Doha. His predecessor, Khalid Mashal, he was running the show from Doha. He still lives in Doha, which I think, again, speaks volumes on who they're supporting. But the Biden administration pressured Qatar to eject them. They moved to Istanbul, Turkey, another sponsor of Hamas. But weeks into the new Trump administration, after the changeover of government happened, some of President Trump's aides came to talk to Doha, and Hamas was allowed back in. They were allowed to set up shop again in Qatar, and to this day, they haven't really had many repercussions from it. Instead, you have Mr. Witkoff again flying over to Qatar to talk to them. You have President Trump accepting a $400 million jet from them, with full knowledge that they were allowed to bring Hamas back in, and Hamas is still organizing its operations from there.
This is a good example of a story where the causes get back to breaking God's law. I mean, we analyze world events through the lens of Bible prophecy, but so much of Bible prophecy is cause and effect, and that God in his Bible lays out a way of life that is going to lead to blessings and abundance, and describes a way of life that, the opposite way of life that leads to cursings and destruction, and it causes those negative things to happen. And so you live a code of morality, and you follow the Bible's code of morality, if we wanted to put it in, I guess, very politically correct terms, but that leads to good outcomes. And what has happened here is this is what looks like a lot of selfishness. One of the things that gets repeated a lot in the Old Testament when it's talking about the criteria for judges and people taking on leadership positions within Israel is that they should not accept gifts. I should have brought my Bible with me, but Proverbs talks about how a gift can pervert judgment. Human nature is very susceptible to that kind of corruption. And I think the fact that the Bible tells judges, well, don't accept gifts, certainly talking about larger scale gifts, I think that just even shows how we can deceive ourselves. We can kind of tell ourselves and justify ourselves, well, yeah, but I won't let this affect my judgment. I won't treat that person any differently. But we can then still go on and treat that person differently and deceive ourselves into thinking, nah, I haven't let that affect my judgment. So we're very susceptible to that. And I think this is a case now that we've seen some incredibly disappointing and even destructive things from the Trump administration. I mean, they're looking like now that instead of getting in the way of Iran getting the bomb the way that they did during the first term in office, they're not going to do that. That you could see an Iranian nuclear bomb more quickly. It's exactly the kind of ceasefire deals and peace deals with Hamas that enabled October 7th. And by pushing for these kind of peace deals, is the Trump administration going to enable a second October 7th? Like, these are incredibly destructive things, incredibly destructive consequences for lawbreaking. That's the sobering reality of what is happening here. And it's tremendously disappointing to see because of how much better this was handled during the first administration. The courage that President Trump showed. He did demonstrate, the way to peace isn't just to meekly compromise with evil organizations like Hamas. He confronted evil powerfully in a way that we haven't seen America do for a long time. I'm thinking about Qasem Soleimani in particular, and Iran learned. So it's sad to see this happen, but it looks like it is law-breaking. It is immorality from people in high office, even within now the Republican Party and the Donald Trump administration, that is going to cause a lot of destruction.
Indeed. And even like you could go back to the Ten Commandments, and there's two of them that deal very much in this kind of situation: "Thou shalt not steal," and "Thou shalt not covet." With "Thou shalt not covet," like it's not even like the physical action itself, but just don't get in the mindset of like wanting all these big shiny things. And obviously there's a lot of spiritual ramifications around that commandment, but accepting bribes or even being of an attitude of showing favoritism to people that treat you like this, that's an aspect of that. But one, you mentioned prophecy. We obviously talk about big picture aspects and laws of cause and effect, etc. But the Bible is also full of specific forecasts and of specific individuals, specific countries, and what they're going to do. One we've gone over and over again is in 2 Kings 14, verses 26 through 28, that speak of a time that the nation of Israel was under bitter affliction, and if God didn't intervene, that the name of Israel would be blotted out from under heaven. This is not just talking about the state of Israel, this is talking about the United States as well. Our free book, The United States and Britain in Prophecy, can explain that in more detail. But in that prophecy, specifically in verse 27, it says that God saved Israel by the hand of Jeroboam.
And what's described there is something that happened historically.
Yes.
But the book of Amos and some of these other books talk about the same events, but in prophetic terms, in something that is yet to happen, and adding in prophecies that did not happen at the time. So that history is prophetic for us, and that's something that Mr. Fleury explains a lot more about in America Under Attack. There's a free book that shows how this time with this ancient Jeroboam II is paralleling what we're seeing with President Trump.
Yes, and specifically those prophecies like in Amos mentioned there being a man named Jeroboam as well. And Mr. Fleury has looked at the ancient Jeroboam. He was a king of Israel, Jeroboam II, and what he did, and said that you could expect somebody like that to come on the scene to do something just like that, to save Israel from its bitter affliction, to bring out a national resurgence. And he pointed to President Trump as being that person. And because of that, we've had a lot of coverage on him, say, fighting a lot of these radical leftist forces in Washington, like Barack Obama, Joe Biden, etc., that were intentionally destroying the United States, and that he was going to bring a bit of a respite from that. But that's not where the story ends with Jeroboam. This is what 2 Kings 14, verse 24, that starts off the Jeroboam section in that book, says about Jeroboam II, quote, "And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Eternal. He departed not from all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin," end quote. So this is talking about Jeroboam I, the northern kingdom of Israel's inaugural king. And you can look at throughout the whole Bible, like from the history of Israel after they split apart, that Jeroboam the son of Nebat, Jeroboam I, everything he did, he made Israel to sin. He tore Israel away from God, and he put Israel down a path from which it never recovered. And Mr. Fleury has said that the modern Jeroboam comes in both the spirit of these two Jeroboam figures. And while President Trump has done a lot in his so far relatively short amount of time in the White House, he's cleaned up a lot of corruption, he's exposed a lot of corruption, he's been helping out a lot of other Israelite nations, like, for example, there's a story of him accepting white South Africans as persecuted refugees. I think that is something good that he's done to his credit. But if he's letting somebody like Sheikh Tamim whisper foreign policy into his ear, the sponsor of Hamas, telling him to tell Israel to stop fighting Hamas, basically being Qatar's conduit to help save Hamas, to help attack the state of Israel, probably the country most with the name of Israel on it, because that's what it's called in modern language today. I mean, God is not going to continue supporting that, and that is ultimately going to bring a lot of other curses to his administration, to the country as a whole. Mr. Fleury wrote a book called Great Again, and the original chapter was based off of a coworker letter that was basically the first major bit of material Mr. Fleury wrote about President Trump all the way back in 2016 in the election there. And here's some quotes from that. "Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor and industrious," citing 1 Kings 11:28, "but he ended up being a disaster for Israel, turning the people away from God by institutionalizing false religion." Further down, "The modern-day Jeroboam commits the same sin that Jeroboam did anciently. There is a reason God uses Jeroboam as the last warning to the nations of Israel. The original Jeroboam committed a great sin, And the modern day Jeroboam is committing the identical sin again. Now, there's a bit of nuance there. Mr. Fleury is speaking about some spiritual problems specifically that are going to happen with the modern Jeroboam and some things going on in America. But you can even see this attitude leaching out in how he's treating the physical Jews in the Middle East. The original Jeroboam, he turned people away from Jerusalem, turned people away from the house of David. He warred with Judah, the king there, Rehoboam, all the days of his life, it says in 1 Kings. And you're seeing that attitude right now play out, even as the state of Israel is fighting for its life, even as it's surrounded by genocidal enemies. You are seeing that attitude leach into President Trump's foreign policy and his connections with Qatar, and this hotline, you could say, between Doha and Washington, carried by these buckets of money, probably has a lot to do with it. And again, yes, President Trump has done a lot of good for America and for some other Israelite countries, and we expect maybe this to continue. The end verdict of Bible prophecy is not that this president is some Superman that's going to solve everything and everything is going to get better and better. That's not the end of the story. There is something about Jeroboam and the sin of Jeroboam we need to beware and we need to be educated about and implement to the best that we can in how we conduct our daily lives, how we analyze the news, and many other ways. God gives us the keys for that, and Mr. Fleury's book, Great Again, and that first chapter specifically, is a good place to start on how to getting educated on this.
Right, and I think this gets to the core of why Donald Trump returned to office, and this is something Mr. Fleury's talked a lot about, and why that return will not save America unless there are some major changes. And in that same book, America Under Attack, America Under Attack and Great Again just fit together perfectly. But he talked in there about, well, the reason why. Well, he said, and Mr. Fleury said before Donald Trump returned to office that he's going to be back. He's going to be back in office. I mean, honestly, we didn't expect him to leave office because we saw these prophecies and saw that they were incomplete, saw that there was still more things that a President Donald Trump would have to do. He was out of office. We said, and we stuck by, well, there's still more for him to do. He's going to be back. And he was back. And that was a fulfilled prophecy. But Mr. Fleury talked about why. And it's not that God is just going to then permanently save the nation through Donald Trump. God saved Donald Trump's life dramatically with that shooting. I guess we're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of that before too long. God saved him for a reason, and that reason is to allow a message to go out of repentance, a message for the nation to turn away from its sins, from its law breaking. And if that doesn't change, if that law breaking doesn't change, okay, some of the really destructive things that Barack Obama were doing, some of the mass migration and things like that were destroying America very quickly, even free speech that was making a message like this very hard to get out. Yeah, God used President Trump to stop some of those things. But it's not put a permanent stop on the destruction of America unless we turn from those sins. And the book of Amos, the same book that talks about Jeroboam, and it has a lot to say about what we're seeing right now. I mean, Amos 5 and verse 12, for example, it says that they afflict the just, they take a bribe. And the book of Amos has a lot about rich people doing wrong, rich people being corrupt, rich people taking bribes, trading dishonestly, manipulating, using false weights and measures. That's in Amos 8 verses 5 and 6. It's a society that's exploitative and has a lot of people just living lives of luxury and not really caring about the plight of the nation. And I don't think what is happening in Qatar is even necessarily the worst example of that. You see this everywhere. You saw it in the pay-to-play kind of scandals of the Biden administration. You see it in the revolving door between regulators and the companies they're supposed to be regulating, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's the defense industry, where you see people going very soft, not punishing wrongdoing, and then getting a job with the wrongdoer later on. Those kind of things are common, and maybe they get around some of the letter of the laws on bribery, but they certainly break God's law. I think you see it in the way that a lot of members of Congress have gotten very rich with questionable deals and insider trading. So, I mean, Qatar, what's going on there is just one dimension of an endemic problem of corruption throughout all levels, throughout the rich. I mean, I'm sure it's there in a whole range of other levels in society. And really, you could look at, say, workers, and I think it's very common now to like work from home that has become a scam for certainly not everyone, but for a lot of people, an easy way to steal time from their employers. There's theft and there's stealing throughout this nation. So my point isn't that this is the worst example of that, but it is that we're not repenting. We're not turning from that. And if we're not turning from that, the curses and the correction are still coming. Cause and effect, but then also God is adding in curses to turn the nation around. And going back to great again, Mr. Fleury wrote in there, America's problems are spiritual and solving them requires spiritual solutions, starting with repentance. But Americans are too entrenched in their sins to do that. So the national curses are going to get far worse before the situation ever gets better. When you understand this spiritual dimension, it becomes far easier to understand why President Obama did the things he did and why the damage he caused will not be reversed by putting a different man into office. What is required is repentance. And this story is both tremendously damaging for the Middle East, but massively damaging for the United States because it shows that repentance is not happening.
And even another prophecy that comes to mind in Isaiah 1, where God talks about the state of the nation, and he says, from the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. The fact that you're seeing this kind of level of corruption going up all the way to the office of the president, God puts a lot of emphasis in his Bible and even just in general principles on the leaders setting examples for people, on the people that are in charge leading the way and for people to go and follow them. And if you're having these high offices, people in high offices doing these kinds of dealings with Qatar, or at least having this kind of history and being pretty unrepentant of it, what example does that set to the rest of the nation? If the 320 or whatever it is millions of Americans look up and see that, okay, this is what the resurgence looks like, so it means accepting Qatari money and paying to play, what influence is that going to have on their own personal lives and on how the rest of society is conducted?
Right, that's a really good point. The whole head is sick. I mean, this isn't even a partisan thing. Like, we could have easily done a whole show about the Uranium One scandal with Hillary Clinton, Burisma, the Biden family's links to China. Like, we're not trying to, we're not saying that Donald Trump is more corrupt, say, than any of these. And maybe, I think a lot of those problems are probably worse than what we've seen with Qatar. But that sickness and that law breaking is there everywhere. And on one level, yeah, I think this is disappointing. I think we were hoping that God really responds to repentance. And there's so many examples in the Bible where he responds to that. And when you saw Donald Trump acknowledging that God saved him, that God protected him, that God returned him to the presidency and worked a miracle, I think we were hopeful that that was leading in that direction. That you'd have a nation, or at least a president, that exhorts the nation to repent. And how would God respond to that? I mean, a lot of that would depend on how individuals, how the nation responded to that. But so much here, as Mr. Fleury said, right from January, this has exposed a side of Donald Trump that we don't want to see. But also going back to great again, Mr. Fleury writes there, the Bible also explains God's ultimate purpose for allowing these curses to descend on the US. Whenever God punishes, he does so to turn people back to himself. Scripture prophesies that the curses America is experiencing today are actually a prelude to national revitalization and restoration. America will, in fact, one day soon become great again. And that's the good news here. These curses are going to get worse. And there's going to be cause and effect. And the deals that are done here in the Middle East and giving into Iran and Hamas, this is going to hurt America badly. And there are more curses that are going to come, and they're going to hurt America badly. But all of this is about God reaching America and turning the nation to him. And when that happens, the nation will be great again. Ultimately, even the way God is working with America is purely about working with the whole world and bringing a message to the whole world. And so it's going to lead to the whole world turning to God. So there is great news at the end here in that book, Great Again, describes that. So you can go, and if you we're very happy to send you free copies of both of those books, America Under Attack and then Great Again. You can get at those on our website, thetrumpet.com. If you have any trouble, you can shoot us an email at trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. If you're from the Qatari government and you would like a more positive coverage from the show, you can send your offer to trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. No, it would take. We're not for sale. We're going to keep sticking with this message. So if you are offering us cash, you'll have to contact someone else to get your positive coverage. Our producer George is sticking his head up. So maybe if you email him personally, he's putting a thumb up. Then some bags of cash might change at least his opinion. We'll have to carefully watch how he edits this show. Well, a bit of fun at the end, but a sobering subject too, but ultimately a hopeful one. Thank you very much to George Haddad for engineering and production, and we'll be back with our regular weekend review show on Friday. Until then, keep watching your world.